Welcome to the 3026 breakdown. I, of course, am John Lee, and this is a brand new feature I'm calling How I Watch Fights. This particular one, I was lucky enough to get on the phone with Dan Levi from Half the Battle podcast, and he dropped so much gold that hopefully I can do it justice. This whole thing started because I often wonder how good MMA handicappers or fight pickers watch fights. So I've started interviewing and asking several top MMA cappers and pickers how they watch fights and what they look for. Think of it as a How I Work feature for picking MMA fights, like the How I Work feature on Lifehacker, which I think is one of the best things they do, where they interview successful CEOs and executives and ask about how they do their workday, like what their rituals are, what equipment they use, all that kind of stuff. So I thought, wouldn't that be cool if there was something for MMA handicapping or MMA betting? Because the results when you Google MMA betting advice or MMA handicapping are pretty dismal. So hopefully this will help anyone out there who actually wants to know what the professionals and the guys who are profitable long term are doing. For my first video, I wanted to pick my personal favorite handicapper and someone I've really learned a lot from, Dan Levi of the Half the Battle podcast. I really love Dan's podcast he does with Sean Carey. I think it's hysterical. I think they often have really good insights that I had not thought of or that are kind of outside of the bubble of traditional handicapping, statistics, technique breakdown, that kind of stuff. They do all that stuff too, but they often have angles that I never would have thought of that end up being really, really valuable. So I highly recommend, if you're not already subscribed to the Half the Battle podcast, that you go there right now and subscribe to it on iTunes because you will learn a lot. Like a lot of fans, Dan got his start training karate and other martial arts and watching fights before deciding that he wanted to get paid for watching fights, a feeling with which I'm very familiar. One of the first things I wanted to know was how many fights of a particular fighter Dan watches and what equipment he watches it on. So Dan told me that he watches a fighter's last 3 fights, and he'll generally watch them either on his iPad, his laptop, on the computer with Fight Pass, wherever. Sometimes he'll use 2 screens, sometimes he'll use 1, depending on what he's looking for. But like myself, Dan watches with no audio on, which I personally believe is the only way to actually watch fights and learn anything about the fighters, because no disrespect to Joe Rogan or Brian Stan or Kenny Florian or John Anik or any of those guys, Mike Goldberg, well, a little disrespect to Mike Goldberg, but they all kind of get caught onto storylines or threads that are happening in fights or things they want to happen or think are happen. And Rogan's been pretty bad this year, where even if the opposite is happening, they'll keep talking about how one fighter is landing or this, that, or the other. So turning the audio off makes a big difference because you can actually start to ask yourself what's actually going on. I asked Dan if there were any other sites or other handicappers out there that he follows, and Dan specifically said he doesn't follow any other cappers and warns bettors to do the same. For Dan, betting is all about belief, and he thinks that no matter what, if you really believe something, if you have a gut feeling, no matter what the experts are saying, no matter what he's saying, what the statistics say, that you have to go on your belief because betting is all about belief. And I truly believe that. I think a lot of times I've talked myself out of bets that I had a good, strong gut belief on, most notably Uriah Hall and Derek Brunson, because I was talked out of it by other people or experts. So I think that's actually really good. The other thing Dan is all about is finding underdogs. When I asked Dan what he does better than other cappers, he said being disciplined and finding underdogs. Discipline is really important when it comes to betting, both in bankroll management and in the amount of plays that you have per card. We both talked about other handicappers out there who will have 10 or 12 plays, and sometimes they have big wins, 10, 20 units, and other times they have big losses. Dan's number one rule is to never bet more than 4 fights per card. No matter how many fights you like, never more than 4. And Dan usually bets between 1 and 4 fights per card, which I think is a really good rule. One of the things that has gotten me into trouble gambling, and then I see getting other people in trouble out there on Twitter and the internet, is having too many bets. So I am definitely adopting this no more than 4 fights per card rule. Dan's number 1A rule is always bet on underdogs. He gave this example. If you go back to UFC 205 and you had bet on Frankie Edgar and Chris Weidman, 2 favorites, or Yoel Romero and Jeremy Steven, 2 underdogs, you get very different results. Edgar was like a minus 330 favorite, I know, because I bet on him. And Weidman, I think, was like minus 185 or something like that. Whereas Romero was like plus 140 and Stevens was like plus 2 something. But if you bet on Frankie Edgar and Chris Weidman, and you win, you still lose money. You go 1-1, sorry. Frankie won, Chris Weidman lost. You go 1-1, you lose money. You get back $100, but you had to spend $180 to bet Chris Weidman, so you're still down 0.8 units. Whereas if you bet on Yoel Romero and Jeremy Stephens, you go 1-1, but you're up 0.4 units. And that's the power of underdogs and finding those right odds to get so that you can win even when you don't win both of your bets or all 4 of your bets. And that is why Dan always bets underdogs. And in the long term, the math does support this. If you were just to blindly bet on underdogs, you would be profitable at around 8 or 9% betting all the events this year. Dan gave me so much great stuff that I wanted to give you a list of some of the things that Dan looks for when making bets. This is a admittedly incomplete list as I was not able to take notes keeping up with all the gold that Dan was giving me. The first thing Dan looks for is heart. And he gave the example coming up this weekend at UFC 207, when this is being recorded, of Antonio Carlos Jr. as a guy who just doesn't fight, right? If you look at his fight with Dan Kelly, he was up 2 rounds, comes out in the 3rd round, gets kneed, the knee breaks his nose, but he kind of just turtles up and wants to get out of there. Just has no heart fighting Vettori this weekend. So just because of that, Dan will fade Carlos Jr. pretty much all the time because he knows in the long run he's going to get put into bad situations and lose. So even if he loses this bet here, betting on the underdog Vettori, in the long run he'll win money on Carlos Jr. One of the things Dan talked about was finding a stable of guys to bet on and a stable of guys to bet against. You know, putting together some guys you can trust like Yoel Romero. Yoel Romero is undefeated in the UFC. If you've bet on Yoel Romero, he's been an underdog a few times, but you've made money every single time. Versus like an Antonio Carlos Jr. where you want to fade him. The second thing he talked about was dudes who have a foot out the door. And Dan made a great 3-unit play a couple weeks ago against Cole Miller on Haruta on whatever that card was. I can't even remember. But Cole Miller gave a bunch of just statements where he was talking about how he pretty much didn't even want to be here, didn't want to be training, didn't want to do any of that stuff. So looking for those kind of outside of the cage things is very powerful. And that's one of the things that I get a lot of out of the Half the Battle podcast. Number 3, pre and post USADA. This is kind of politically incorrect, but if you look at guys before USADA and after USADA, it's definitely a thing. You look at Junior Dos Santos, who's in this picture. You look at the TJ Dillashaw pictures, pre and post USADA, Chris Weidman. Dudes are skinny and dudes do not look the same. So keeping that in mind, look to fade those guys who have looked different post USADA. I think that's a very valuable gambling strategy and something I'd actually like to look into the research of. You know, pick maybe 10 guys who pre-USADA were like killers, like Johnny Hendricks, Weidman, etc., and then look at their numbers post-USADA. I bet you that would bear out a lot of what Dan was saying. Number 4, guys who fight or cheat or bore to win. When you're betting, you don't want to bet on guys just because they're exciting. Dan was talking about this, how on his show he has exciting fighters on, but if you're betting on someone, you just want guys who win. So you need someone who's going to fight, right? You don't want a guy like Zach Makovsky who just isn't really going to fight. He's going to get down. He's going to still keep doing the same things he did. You want a guy like Tony Ferguson who's going to fight for your money, who no matter what position he's in, he's never going to stop coming. And additionally, you want guys who cheat, right? Cheating pays. All hail Dundasso. #Dundasso. But guys who, kick low like Alan Jobann, when I was watching the Mike Perry, Alan Jobann tape study a couple weeks ago, I actually didn't bet on Mike Perry, even though I thought he was going to win, because Alan Jobann consistently cheats. He kicks guys low, he pokes dudes in the eye, and I was like, man, like that dude's going to want to win and he's going to be willing to cheat. And Mike Perry hasn't shown that. We haven't seen that. Or Bohr. Colby Covington had a good example just last weekend at the UFC on Fox 22 where he was heavily favored and he was winning, and in the third round, he just backed off. He didn't even try to fight. He was getting in exchanges with Barberena and then just backed off because he knew he was going to win, and all he had to do was coast. That's what you want to look for. You want to look for guys who win. They'll do whatever it takes to win. They don't care. They'll cheat, whatever. And number 5, the right price. Dan was very insistent about looking at multiple sportsbooks' price. Now, I bet out here in Vegas, not online, so it's a pain in the ass for me, but I actually do this as well because if I can get an extra $20, $25 for driving to a couple of different casinos that probably takes me less than an hour, it's worth it. So if you're betting online, definitely compare prices because that stuff adds up. Getting a person at the right price, like Amanda Nunes is a great example. There are people who got Amanda Nunes plus 225 when that line first started getting offered. Right now she's plus 120. You got an extra $100 just from jumping on that earlier if she wins. So being aware of the price, shopping around for prices, being stingy with the prices you're getting, and making sure you get the right price will help you to be profitable in the long term. Oh man, there was so much other stuff we couldn't get to. Dan also messaged me afterwards saying he prioritizes a guy with a good get-up game over a guy with good takedown defense. And man, there was just a lot of stuff. Dan's super awesome. He's really funny. This was a great interview. Dan Levi is a long-term winning MMA bettor and the host of the hysterical and highly informative MMA handicapping podcast, Half the Battle. Dan was nice enough to sit down with me for about an hour and share all of this great advice for all of you out there who want to know how to watch fights like the pro handicappers. So be sure to subscribe to his podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, or listen to it at www.bestfightpicks.com/podcast. And while Dan doesn't tout, and I am against touts in general, you can tail Dan's bets on betmma.tips and follow him on Twitter at bestfightpicks. You're going to learn a lot. I highly recommend him. He's funny. Definitely check his stuff out. If you like my stuff, you'll like his stuff. So thanks, Dan, for sitting down to do this. This has been the first edition of How I Watch Fights. I'm John Lee, and I will talk to you soon.